9 years alone, the saddest loyalty story in history. The snow fell softly over the quiet farm in Akita, Japan. It was November 1923, and the winter air smelled of pine and frozen earth. Professor Hidesaburo Ueno, a kind-faced man with round glasses, walked carefully across the snowy yard. His boots crunched on the fresh powder as he approached the dog breeder's small wooden house. "You said you had a new litter?" the professor asked, rubbing his gloved hands together for warmth. The breeder nodded and led him to a small pen where 5 puppies tumbled over each other, their fur fluffy and white like the snow outside. But one puppy sat apart from the rest, smaller, quieter, his dark eyes serious. The professor knelt down. The little Akita puppy looked up at him. For a moment neither moved. Then the puppy's tail gave a single hesitant wag. "You're all alone." "Just like me," the professor murmured, smiling. "Want to come home?" The puppy, barely 2 months old, lifted his tiny paw and placed it on the professor's knee. That was all the answer he needed. The train ride back to Tokyo was long, but the puppy didn't make a sound. He curled up in the professor's coat, his small body warm against the winter chill. When they arrived at the professor's small house near the university, the puppy hesitated at the door. "It's all right," the professor said gently. "This is your home now." The puppy stepped inside. His nose twitched at the new smells: old books, warm tea, the faint scent of the professor's wool scarf. That night, instead of sleeping in the basket the professor had prepared, the puppy climbed onto his shoes and fell asleep there, as if afraid his new owner might disappear. The next morning, the professor laughed when he found the puppy still, curled on his shoes. "You're going to follow me everywhere, aren't you?" And he did. To the university, where the puppy waited patiently outside the lecture hall. To the market, where he trotted beside the professor like a small, furry shadow. Even to the bathhouse, where he sat outside, ears perked, waiting for the professor to emerge. One evening, as the professor graded papers at his desk, the puppy, now named Hachiko, 8 for his lucky number, climbed into his lap and promptly fell asleep. The professor didn't move him. He just smiled and kept working, one hand resting on Hachiko's small, warm back. By spring, Hachiko had grown. His fluffy puppy fur gave way to the strong, proud coat of an Akita. But one thing never changed: his devotion to the professor. Every morning, rain or shine, they walked together to Shibuya Station. The professor would pat Hachiko's head and say, "Wait for me, I'll be back at 3. Hachiko always did. At first, the station workers chuckled at the sight of the big white dog sitting perfectly still by the ticket gate, eyes fixed on the arriving trains. But as weeks turned into months, they grew used to him, the professor's loyal companion, who never left his post until the clock struck 3 and his owner appeared. One afternoon, as they walked home, the professor glanced down at Hachiko. "What if I never come back one day?" he joked. Hachiko stopped walking. His ears twitched and he tilted his head, staring up at the professor with dark, questioning eyes. The professor quickly knelt and ruffled his fur. "Don't worry, I'll always come home to you." But Hachiko didn't wag his tail this time. He just pressed closer to the professor's side, as if he could already sense the future. The morning ritual never changed. At precisely 7:15, the front door would creak open, and Hachiko would spring to his feet, his tail sweeping the floor in wide, joyful arcs. Professor Ueno would pat his head, slip the leather leash around his collar, and together they would walk the quiet Tokyo streets to Shibuya Station. The station workers came to know them well. The newspaper vendor would always save an extra scrap of meat for Hachiko. The ticket collector kept a special bowl of water by his booth. And every day at 3:05 p.m. without fail, Hachiko would be waiting by the 3rd bench when the afternoon train arrived. "Your shadow's here early today, Professor," the station master called out one rainy afternoon as Hachiko took his usual position. "The aim," Professor chuckled, kneeling to rub Hachiko's ears. "He's better at keeping time than the station clock, aren't you, boy?" Hachiko responded by licking his master's glasses, leaving smudges that made the students at Tokyo University tease their professor about his dog vision. As the years passed, Their routine became as natural as breathing. In spring, cherry blossoms would rain down on them like pink snow, sticking to Hachiko's thick coat. Summer brought scorching heat that made his tongue loll out comically until the professor started carrying a canteen just for him. Autumn painted their path in fiery reds, Hachiko bounding through piles of leaves like a puppy again. And winter. Winter was special. One particularly. Brutal snowstorms saw the professor arrive at the station to find Hachiko already waiting, his white fur nearly indistinguishable from the snowdrifts piling around him. Without a word, the professor opened his large black umbrella and held it. Over them both all the way home, his free hand buried in Hachiko's warm fur. The small moments built their world. The way the professor would sneak Hachiko bits of fish from his lunchbox. How Hachiko learned to carry the newspaper gently in his teeth each morning. The quiet evenings when the professor would read aloud while Hachiko rested his head on his slippers, content just to be near. Then came the cough. It started small, just a clearing of the throat here and there. But one chilly morning, the professor doubled over in a sudden fit, clutching his chest. Hachiko was at his side instantly, whining deep in his throat, nudging the professor's hand with his wet nose. "It's nothing, boy," the professor managed after catching his breath, though his face was pale. He gave Hachiko's head a reassuring pat. "Just getting old, that's all." The next morning dawned bright and clear. Hachiko waited by the door as usual, tail wagging as the professor tied his shoes. But when they reached the station, something felt different. The professor knelt down and held Hachiko's face in both hands, looking into his eyes longer than usual. "You'll wait for me, won't you?" he asked softly. Hachiko licked his chin in response, making the professor laugh. "Good boy, I'll see you at 3. As the professor walked toward his train, he turned back one last time and smiled. Hachiko watched until his master disappeared into the crowd, not knowing why his chest felt suddenly tight, why his instincts told him to run after the retreating figure. But he stayed, because good dogs wait, and Hachiko was the best of them all. The clock tower above Shibuya Station struck 3. Hachiko's ears perked up, his tail giving a single thump against the wooden platform. Around him, passengers streamed off the arriving train in their usual hurry, businessmen adjusting their hats, students laughing, mothers scolding wandering children. Hachiko's dark eyes scanned every face. The crowd thinned. The platform emptied. Still, he waited. At the university, the lecture hall was unusually quiet. Professor Ueno had been in the middle of explaining Kant's moral philosophy when his hand flew to his chest. His chalk clattered to the floor as he collapsed. Students rushed forward, but by the time the doctor arrived, it was too late. The clock on the classroom wall read 2:47 p.m. Back at the station, the tea vendor wiped his counter and glanced at the motionless white dog. "Go home, boy," he said softly. "He's not coming today." Hachiko didn't budge. His paws remained planted on the exact spot where the professor always found him. As evening fell, the station master tried to shoo him away, but Hachiko simply circled twice and lay down, his chin resting on his paws. That night, the professor's daughter came searching. She knelt in the dim station light, her tears falling on Hachiko's head. "Come home, Hachi," she pleaded, fingers trembling in his fur. But when she stood to leave, Hachiko stayed. Days turned to weeks. The tea vendor began leaving scraps by the ticket booth. The newspaper seller saved yesterday's headlines to lay over wet patches on the platform. Regular committers would pause to pat Hachiko's graying muzzle, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. Winter came early that year. Icy winds howled through the station, but Hachiko kept his vigil. Snow dusted his back like a shawl, melting slowly from his body heat. One particularly cruel morning, a new station master, a young man who didn't know the story, kicked at Hachiko's legs. "Shoo, mutt, no strays allowed." Hachiko didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth, just lifted his head and stared with eyes that held 9 years of love. The station master's boot hesitated mid-air. Something in that gaze made him lower his foot and walk away muttering. Outside, the first snowflakes of another winter began to fall. Hachiko watched them dance in the station lights, remembering how the professor's umbrella had sheltered them. Both. His tail gave one slow wag against the cold concrete. Then he settled back to wait. Because if he waited long enough, surely the 3:05 train would finally bring his friend home. The seasons turned like pages in a book no one else was reading. At tea. First, it was just the regulars, the tea vendor who saved his best scraps, the newspaper seller who spread out old editions when the platform grew damp. Then others began noticing. Women on their way to market would pause to leave rice balls wrapped in bamboo leaves. School children saved bits of their lunches to place before the old white dog, who never moved from his spot. One rainy afternoon in Hachiko's 10th year of waiting, a man in a trench coat knelt beside him. The flashbulb popped before Hachiko could blink. "Tokyo Daily News," the reporter said, scratching behind Hachiko's ears in just the way the professor used to. "They're calling you the soul of Shibuya, you know." The article ran with the headline, "Faithful Akita waits for master who will never return." By week's end, pilgrims began arriving. Elderly couples holding hands, young soldiers on leave, even a group of nuns who sang quiet hymns as they patted Hachiko's graying head. The station became something holy. Then on a spring morning thick with cherry blossoms, a familiar scent made Hachiko's tail thump weakly against the platform. The professor's wife stood before him, her black mourning kimono now faded to gray, her face lined with years he hadn't witnessed. She knelt with a sound like dry leaves cracking. "Oh, Hachi," she whispered, her wrinkled hands hovering over his muzzle. "You waited all these years?" Hachiko licked her fingers. They tasted like home, like the professor's study and warm tea and all the good things he remembered. But when the 3:05 train whistled in the distance, his head snapped toward the sound. The woman's breath hitched. She pressed her forehead to his. "He loved you so," she said, voice breaking. "We all did." That night, as the station lights flickered and the last train departed, Hachiko dreamed. Sunlight, endless fields of golden grass. And there, far ahead, a familiar silhouette in a brown tweed coat, turning with outstretched arms. Hachiko ran like he hadn't in years, his legs strong again, his breath coming in joyful pants. The professor smelled of chalk and citrus and home as Hachiko crashed into him, licking his laughing face. "Good boy," the professor kept saying, fingers buried in thick fur. "My good boy." Somewhere beyond the dream, on a cold station bench in Tokyo, Hachiko's breathing slowed. His tail gave one final, contented thump against the wood. The winter of 1935 was the coldest Tokyo had seen in years. Icicles hung like crystal daggers from the station roof, and the wind howled through the platforms with a voice that sounded almost human. Hachiko lay curled on his usual bench, his once white fur now yellowed with age, his breathing slow and labored. At exactly 2:55 p.m., his ears twitched. Slowly, with effort that made his joints creak, Hachiko raised his head. The station clock's minute hand trembled toward the 12. Somewhere down the tracks a train whistle blew. The clock struck 3. A warm breeze, out of place in the freezing air, ruffled Hachiko's fur. The pain in his old bones faded. He stood, really stood, for the first time in months, his tail wagging weakly. The platform around him grew brighter, the edges of the world softening like a watercolor painting left in the rain. Then he saw him. Professor Ueno stood by the ticket gate, looking exactly as Hachiko remembered, the kind wrinkles around his eyes, the slightly crooked tie, the way his coat always seemed one size too large. He knelt and opened his arms. "Good boy," the professor whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Let's go home." Hachiko ran. He ran like he hadn't since he was a puppy, his legs strong, his heart light. When he crashed into the professor's chest, he was overwhelmed by familiar scents, chalk dust, bergamot tea, the faint hint of cherry blossoms from their walks home. The professor's arms wrapped around him, warm and solid and real. Behind them, on the cold station bench, Hachiko's earthly body lay still. A station worker approached, then crossed himself and ran to fetch others. But Hachiko didn't look back. He pressed against the professor's side as they walked toward a golden light at the end of the platform, the professor's hand resting lightly between his ears, just like old times. Today, if you visit Shibuya Station, you'll see a bronze statue of an Akita dog. His ears are perked, his tail slightly curled, his eyes fixed on the arrival gates. Schoolchildren rub his nose for good luck. Tourists take selfies, but sometimes, if you look closely, you'll notice an elderly person pause before the statue. They might lay a single flower at its base, or whisper something only they can hear before moving on. And if you're there at exactly 3:05 p.m. when the afternoon train arrives, when the sunlight hits the bronze just right, you could almost swear you see two shadows where there should be one. A tall man in an old-fashioned coat and a happy white dog trotting beside him. Some bonds never break, not even time can untie them.